thank you for having me back. As many of you are aware and heard earlier, each year the UUA holds a General Assembly where thousands of UUs gather in person or online to decide the business of our association, to participate in workshops and justice activities, to listen to speeches and reports from UU leaders, and to socialize with UUs from across the country. Last June, over 2,500 delegates made what the UU world described as a momentous General Assembly delegate vote. A years-long process culminated in 80% of the delegates voting in favor of a total revision of Article 2 of the UUA bylaws. This is the part of the bylaws that includes, among other things, a section containing the 7 principles. For the past 40 years, the core statement describing Unitarian Universalism. The handout you should all have received. The handout contains the revised section, which substitutes 6 values centered in love and their associated covenant statements in place of the 7 principles. The bylaws even includes the graphic of the values shown in the handout. I forgot my bag. It's also on my bag. Sure. There's merch. Yeah. See? Like that. So, this change from principles to values was not without controversy. But after several years of discussion, it was adopted as a new way to view Unitarian Universalism and present it to the world in the 21st century. That is not to say the principles have been abandoned. They still remain in the gray hymnals, on congregation walls, and in the hearts of many UUs. But the values now offer us a different lens to understand Unitarian Universalism. And, as you'll hear in a few minutes, there is a natural relationship between the values and the principles. So today, I want to share with you this new perspective on Unitarian Universalism and what it means for our faith. In preparing for this sermon, I began my research, as is my wont these days, by engaging with ChatGPT. I asked it a series of questions about the change from principles to values. As I considered how to incorporate the wealth of information, 12 pages worth, that I received, I realized this was the sermon. So I would like to share with you my Q&A with ChatGPT about the new UUA value statement, with some of the answers shortened for the sake of time. So what is the relationship between values and principles? Values are the core beliefs or ideals that individuals or organizations hold as fundamentally important. Principles are the actionable expression of values. Values inspire principles. Principles are often derived from values. For example, if a person values honesty, a guiding principle might be always speak the truth. Values are foundational, principles are operational. Values form the foundation of identity and culture, while principles offer a practical way to live out those values. In a Unitarian Universalist context, for example, the values might include love, justice, and interdependence, while the principles derived from those values guide behavior, such as respecting the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The recently adopted new values by the UUA reflect this relationship, with the values serving as a foundation and the principles evolving to reflect contemporary challenges and aspirations. What have philosophers said about values? Now here, ChatGPT provided answers for a dozen philosophers from ancient to contemporary times. For the sake of time, I'll skip to my follow-up question. Do the recently adopted UUA value statements centered in love and their covenant statements align more closely to one or more of these philosophical positions? The UUA's focus on covenant, committing to shared values through collective action, resonates with existentialist ideas, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre's view that values are not inherent, but are created through choices and lived experience. The UUA framework emphasizes the dynamic, evolving nature of values within a pluralistic community. aligning with existentialist emphasis on responsibility and freedom in shaping meaning. The UUA's commitment to values like justice aligns well with pragmatism, particularly John Dewey's perspective that values are tested and refined through human experience and social interaction. Pragmatists view values as fluid and evolving rather than fixed, which fits with the UUA's adaptive and responsive approach to social issues. The UUA's centering of love as the core value aligns with Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, which means flourishing or well-being. In this framework, values guide individuals and communities to become their best selves through ethical practice and reflection. The commitment to justice, equity, and inherent worth reflects aspects of Kantian ethics, which argues that moral values should apply universally and be grounded in respect for human dignity. The UUA's focus on equity and interdependence draws heavily from contemporary social justice philosophy, including liberation theology and intersectionality. This perspective sees values as rooted in relationships and collective liberation efforts. In conclusion, the UUA's recently adopted values and covenant statements reflect a blend of philosophical traditions. The emphasis on love as a guiding principle suggests a holistic, relational approach that acknowledges the evolving and communal nature of ethical living. You said the UUA framework emphasizes the dynamic, evolving nature of values within a pluralistic community. Could you elaborate on that? The UUA's framework emphasizes that values are not static, fixed truths, but rather living commitments that evolve over time as individuals and communities grow in their understanding and as context changes. Unitarian Universalism, being a pluralistic tradition, welcomes diverse theological and philosophical perspectives, meaning values must remain flexible and responsive to the needs and insights of an ever-changing world. Rather than rigid adherence to doctrine, UUs make promises or covenants to one another, which can be reevaluated, reshaped based on new experiences, new relationships, and social challenges. The transition from the original 7 principles to the new values-based framework illustrates how UUism continually reinterprets itself to address contemporary moral and social realities. In short, UUs understand values as guiding stars, not rigid rules, allowing space for evolving interpretations while maintaining a core commitment to shared ethical ideals. One tension within UUism is that between individualism and community. You touched on that already, but could you address this more directly? Do the values lean one way more than the other? Did the change from principles to values reflect a change in this tension? This is a long-standing and central tension within Unitarian Universalism. Rooted in Enlightenment ideals and the Transcendentalist movement, UUism places a strong emphasis on personal conscience, spiritual exploration, and self-determination. The first principle's emphasis on the inherent worth and dignity of every person underscores this focus on individualism. At the same time, UUism recognizes the interconnected nature of existence and the need for collective action, justice, and mutual accountability. The 7th principle's emphasis on the interdependent web of all existence leans in this direction. The shift from principles to values reflects a subtle movement toward community and collective accountability, emphasizing relationality over radical individualism. The new values framework, centered in love, explicitly calls for covenant and shared responsibility in ways that require individuals to balance their autonomy with their obligations to the whole. The language of covenant reinforces this by suggesting that individuals' freedoms are best realized within the context of collective commitments. Is love considered a value like the other 6, or is it something different? In the new UUA values framework, love is not just one value among many. It is the foundation that undergirds all the other values. The values are explicitly described as being centered in love, meaning that love serves as the moral and spiritual core from which the values arise. This positioning suggests that love is a guiding principle, the lens through which the other values are understood and lived. Unlike the other 6 values, which represent specific ethical commitments, love is a more fundamental orientation that binds and animates them. Love in this framework is not simply an emotion, but a practice of justice, compassion, and connection, a call to action that informs the ways in which individuals and communities interact with the world. Thus, love is both the foundation and the aspiration, providing cohesion and deeper meaning to the 6 articulated values. One of the concerns that the revision of Article 2 was asked to address was the absence of love from Article 2. Do you think that was an oversight when the principles were adopted in 1961 and then revised in 1985? Or was there some deeper meaning behind its absence before and its inclusion now? The absence of love in the original 1961 principles and the 1985 revision was likely not an oversight, but rather a reflection of the theological and cultural context of those times. When the Unitarian and Universalist tradition merged in 1961, the focus was largely on crafting a statement that honored both traditions without leaning too heavily on any one theological concept. The language chosen reflected an effort to balance religious pluralism, rational inquiry, and humanist values. The principles focused on human dignity, freedom, and justice, which were seen as the ethical manifestations of love without explicitly naming it. The 1985 revision that led to the well-known 7 principles leaned into inclusivity, pluralism, and justice, but again avoided explicitly theological language, likely to remain accessible to both theists and humanists within UUism. Love, being a term often associated with Christian theology, may have been seen as too specific or even redundant, given the emphasis on compassion, justice, and equity. The inclusion of love in the 2024 revision reflects a cultural and theological shift in Unitarian Universalism. Today's UUs recognize that social justice and equity efforts must be rooted in something deeper than intellectual commitment. Love provides that moral and emotional grounding. And in a time of increasing social fragmentation, centering love signals a desire to reconnect with a unifying and healing force. Universalism, in particular, has long affirmed the power of divine and human love as a force for salvation and transformation, making this shift a reclaiming of heritage rather than an entirely new concept. In essence, its absence in earlier statements reflected a more intellectual and justice-oriented framing, while its inclusion now signals a more holistic, heart-centered approach to UU identity and mission. Concept of love has always been at the center of UUism, as seen in many of our hymns and justice campaigns. It has been said that people differ on social issues because they emphasize different sets of values, and that we shouldn't ask which position is right or wrong, but which is more loving. Does this relate to the centered in love idea? Yes. This idea aligns closely with the concept of being centered in love, as it encourages moving beyond divisive debates about who is right or wrong, and instead evaluating actions and positions based on their alignment with the core value of love. Framing social issues through love asks questions like, does this action promote connection and healing rather than division and harm? This perspective can help bridge ideological divides by focusing on shared values and common humanity rather than political or philosophical differences. It encourages compassion and empathy rather than rigid adherence to a particular stance. In a denomination that includes theists, atheists, and humanists, love provides a common moral and spiritual language that transcends belief systems. The shift to centering UU values in love represents both an evolution and a return to core spiritual ideals. It acknowledges that love is the foundation, lens, and goal of UU communities, inviting individuals and communities to engage in justice, equity, and interdependence through a lens of deep care and connection. Final question. If you had been a delegate at the 2024 UUA General Assembly, would you have voted for the Article 2 revision? I would likely have voted in favor of the Article 2 revision for several reasons. Unitarian Universalism is a living tradition, and our guiding documents must evolve to reflect who we are today. The shift from the 7 principles to the values-based framework acknowledges the changing spiritual and social landscape of our faith. The explicit focus on love as the foundation brings a deeper moral and spiritual grounding that resonates with our historical Universalist roots while also responding to contemporary challenges. The previous principles served us well, but the new values language offers a more dynamic, actionable, and relational approach, something our movement needs to stay relevant and effective in a complex world. One of the strengths of the revision is its emphasis on covenant and accountability, which goes beyond just affirming ideals to calling for concrete commitments. The language of the original principles, while aspirational, could sometimes feel passive or abstract. The new values call for engagement, transformation, and relationship building, reinforcing that our faith is not just about individual belief, but communal action. The revision also acknowledges the evolving understanding of justice, equity, and inclusion, responding to the critiques that the previous wording lacked explicit commitments to dismantling oppression and addressing systemic injustices. The inclusion of terms like equity and pluralism highlights an intentional move towards a more inclusive and justice-centered UUism. One concern with the traditional principles was the perception that they leaned heavily on individual autonomy, potentially at the expense of communal accountability. The new values better articulate the interdependent nature of our faith, ensuring that while individual dignity is still honored, it is held in the context of our shared responsibility to one another and to the planet. By emphasizing interdependence and pluralism, the revision creates space for a more communal understanding of our faith, something that is increasingly needed in today's world of social fragmentation and division. As we discussed earlier, the absence of love in the original principles was a notable gap. The revision addresses this by making love the central moral and spiritual foundation, which aligns with the lived experience of UUs in congregational life, social justice work, and spiritual practice. The explicit focus on love strengthens our theological grounding and provides a clear, universal touchstone for our work in the world. Ultimately, the revision provides a stronger, more future-oriented foundation for our faith. I would have voted yes, not because the 7 principles were inadequate, but because the new values better reflect who we are today and who we aspire to be. The revision provides a compelling and actionable framework that will help Unitarian Universalism continue to grow as a force for love, justice, and transformation in the world. Thank you, ChatGPT. Okay.